Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this debate about China and its challenges, international challenges mainly. First of all, I want to thank the sponsor of the Asian program, Banco Bocom BBN. Our guest today is Yun Sun. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and co-director of the Asia program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center, a Washingtonian think tank. Her expertise is in China foreign policy, US-China relations, and China's relations with neighboring countries and also with Africa. She is also a columnist at The Wire China, a digital publication that many of us who follow China read on a regular basis. And she also is a frequent guest at many Chinese TV programs and at the Chinese press, including South China Morning Post, the Hong Kongese newspaper. Thank you very much, Yun Sun, for accepting the invitation.
Thank you, Ambassador, for having me. It's a true pleasure.
Well, let me start with the Ukrainian war and the Chinese position about the war. In a recent comment that I read by you in The Wire, you said that China has a neutral position, but in the West, this position is not well understood because the notion of neutrality for China is not the same notion of neutrality for the United States and the West. And now we see the Europeans putting more pressure on China. You see, they want China to have a more active role in the solution of the Ukrainian dilemma. You see the Americans saying that China should not help Russia to circumvent the sanctions. And it's interesting that Janet Yellen is the person who voices this American position, which I interpret as a hint that if China helps Russia to circumvent the sanctions, China may be itself subject to some sanctions. And we also have President Zelensky that is asking China to intervene and to help a more direct position on the conflict. But it seems that China is not going to change. I want to hear from you. What's your assessment of the Chinese position? Do you believe that China is going to make moves? China is going to change? Also, we have Russia. We have the suspicion in general that China may help Russia by providing arms and weapons to the Russian side. So there's a lot of confusion about where China is heading at this point. And I would like to hear from you on that.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a very heavy question. I think to begin with, the neutrality that China claims that it adopts on the issue of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine is a pro-Russia neutrality. There's no doubt that the China-Russia strategic alignment has accelerated in recent years, especially given the growing sense of US-China strategic competition or great power competition, whichever you choose. I think the Chinese certainly, they feel the natural need to seek alignment with Russia in order to avoid isolation and also to use the coalition, the aligned capability to boost its own ability to compete with the United States and to deal with what they call the hostility from the United States. I think this geopolitical instinct is the overwhelming central theme of China's dealing with Russia in the event of the Ukraine war. And just to put it simply, this one word, geopolitics outweighs all other considerations. And for the Chinese, when they're faced with the mostly Western demands for China to take a clearer position to oppose Russia in the war in Ukraine, I think the Chinese natural first thought is that, well, if Russia loses, then we will be the next. And there's no incentive for China to deliver Russia or to help the West or help the United States on Russia, because for China, the most important relationship is, of course, with the United States. And if US will continue to treat China as the most consequential strategic adversary and challenge, regardless of what position China adopts on Russia, then for China, the payoff shows no variation, meaning that no matter what China does, US is going to treat China as an enemy. It is. So therefore, China will do its own calculation that, well, maybe we don't want Russia to go away. Maybe we don't want Russia to lose. I think that's primarily why we see this ambiguity in China's position towards Russia in this war. But don't take this wrong. I think the Chinese do not like the war in Ukraine. They see this as a strategic loss for China. But helping Russia is not going to make China in a better position. In fact, it could make China end up in a worse position. That's why we see the position that China is taking today. On the issue of, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to make a quick remark, make a quick comment about the issue of sanction. I think Washington's worry about China providing assistance to Russia or financing to Russia is well justified. Because if you look at what happened during the first Ukraine crisis back in 2014, the Crimea crisis, the Chinese did exploit the opportunity. They were able to, I think the most important projects that they were able to sign was the Yamal LNG project in Russia's high north. China provided funding. China was offered 30% stakes of that project. And that would not have happened had Russia not been put under the severe international sanction after the annexation of Crimea. But this time around, I think what has changed is that, first off, the international background has changed. Back in 2014, we did not have the concept of the US-China great power competition as the overarching theme of the bilateral relations back then. So that is to say, the relationship between China and the US is much more hostile and tense than what it was 8 years ago. So this makes Chinese much more aware of the potential consequences of helping Russia, which gets to the issue of sanction. But sanction also has a caveat, which is, what is the target of the sanction? If you think about it, the most important aspect of China's trade with Russia is energy. And European countries do import energy from Russia, so China is not alone. And India still imports energy from Russia. India even did not go with the United States in terms of the condemnation of Russia for the war in Ukraine. So which means that on the issue of sanction, I think the Chinese are very clear that we're not going to sign new deals with Russia. We're not going to exploit the opportunity like we did in 2014. And we're going to abide by the US sanctions in order to avoid more severe secondary sanctions on China. And remember, China is already under a lot of sanctions by the United States. Yes. So I think the fear for severe US sanctions is a primary motivation for China to have avoided providing Russia with more assistance so far. And that may not be a sustainable strategy, because there are also skepticisms in China saying, or questioning, well, if we continue to refrain from providing assistance to Russia, wouldn't that play into the US game, the US trap to divide and conquer China and Russia? If we do not fulfill our Russian friends' demand for us to help them, then US would be successful to undermine our strategic alignment. So I think this voice is getting stronger in China, which does raise the question about the prospect and the sustainability of China's observation or adherence to the US sanctions so far.
My feeling is that to a large extent, China is respecting the sanctions because, well, China already has an exposure in the international financial system. It has a few of the largest banks in the world. And it's very much exposed to the dollar economy, and you cannot change this reality from night to day. But at some point, I keep asking myself, how long can China respect the sanctions? To what extent China will have to change its own position in the future? Because if Russia is going to depend more and more economically on China, it's going to be unavoidable to give some financial support to Russia. And you also have the position of the NDB, for example, the New Development Bank. The New Development Bank decided to put the Russian portfolio on hold. I mean, new loans and disbursements of previous loans. For how long this is going to be there the same way? You see, that's my feeling, that at some point in time, China will have to change its own position about sanctions. And then things may get much more complicated than today.
I absolutely agree with you, Ambassador. I think you are absolutely correct that for how long can this last, right? So far, Russia is able to continue to export its energy to China and India based on the agreement reached before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I would say that the revenue source for Russia has not been completely cut off. And remember, this energy export is not currently being sanctioned by the United States for a variety of reasons. So I would say that the financial flow to the revenue flow to Russia is not completely severed at this point. And as for the financing, you raised a very good point. NDB has suspended lending to Russia. AIIB and several other Chinese banks have also, for the fear of the Western sanctions, also put Russia on the back burner. But how long is that going to last? Well, that question, the answer to that question depends on the development on the battlefield, right? If what the Russians call the special military operation in Ukraine could in the future come to a conclusion. We don't know what that looks like, and we don't know when that is going to happen. But if the war is over, then what would be the continued justification of the United States to continue to put Russia under the severe sanction? So I think the battlefield development or the conclusion of the war is really the most important independent variable in this equation. I'm sure China would love to provide Russia with financing, with financial resources, and also exploit the infrastructure market and also the energy market that Russia has to offer. But at the same time, the Chinese cost-benefit calculation, the analysis based on what cost China needs to carry. And the cost China needs to carry very much depends on whether Russia is still actively engaged in the war with Ukraine on the battlefield. So I think it really goes back to the issue of the development on the battlefield and the conclusion of the war.
Yeah, very much true. Let me focus a little bit on the United States, taking from your observations about the US. When Biden was elected, there was general hope that relations would get better between China and the United States. But the fact remains that at this point in time, it seems that both countries are strategically unwilling to reach any understanding. And the economic and strategic dialogue is frozen. There is no dialogue between the two countries. And then this has an impact on the internal reality in China, because I think that some special groups within the party, the more I wouldn't say radical, but the groups that are more faithful to the ideology of the party become stronger. What's your view on that? Do you think there's some hope? There's any hope about the China and the US at least restarting the economic and strategic dialogue?
That's a very good question. I think there are a couple of caveats here. First, in terms of the state of US-China relations, I think people would agree that Biden administration did not or will not reverse the current direction on its China policy, because the current trajectory of the China policy that basically sees China as the most important strategic challenge to the United States is based on a bipartisan consensus. There might be disagreement as for how US should approach the China challenge, but there's no disagreement in the United States that China is the challenge. So I think that's to say that the direction has not been reversed. So the Chinese would agree that, well, the deterioration of US-China relations has continued under the Biden administration, although deterioration is very different from free fall. And remember, during the last year of the Trump administration, free fall was a key word used to describe the state of US-China relations. So it has not stopped the downward slope, but at least in terms of the style, it's no longer as dramatic and as intense as it was during the year of 2020. Coming to US and China, I think there's a fundamental difference in their approach to each other. US sees that, well, issues are compartmentalized. We're going to confront when we have to. We're going to cooperate when we can, and we will compete as we should, right? So the three concepts of confrontation, competition, and cooperation, from the perspective of the current administration, they're separated and they're compartmentalized. So that's why US feels that, well, of course we can compete, but on the other hand, we can also cooperate on issues like North Korea, Iran, climate change, nuclear proliferation. But the Chinese approach is the opposite. The Chinese adopts approach of issue linkage. An ambassador, as a senior diplomat, you know that in diplomacy, everything is linked to everything else, right? There's always a trade-off, there's a quid pro quo. So the Chinese would say that, well, wait a minute, if we're competing, then I don't see any need or any justification or incentive for us to cooperate with you. We cooperate with you on Russia. It's not going to make us any less of an enemy for the United States, right? So the Chinese would say that, well, if you want to cooperate, let's bargain. Let's talk about leverages. Let's talk about what US will have to do in order to get China on board for a specific agenda. And that approach is not accepted by Washington. And the Washingtonian, the US government will say, well, then never mind, let's not cooperate, which is why that so far, almost a year and a half into the Biden administration, we have seen very few dialogues about cooperation on specific issues. And the concrete result of such cooperation is even less visible, is even less evident to identify. On the issue of the strategic and economic dialogue, I think by the time that Trump inaugurated as the president, there was already this consensus in Washington that SNED was no longer serving the American purpose. It has become such a monstrous, ginormous operation every year, and it's more about symbolism rather than substance. It became a talk shop that both governments has to mobilize tremendous amount of human resources to engage and to produce a long laundry list of so-called issue of US-China cooperation, including things as inconsequential as US-China movie festival cooperation. So I think by the beginning of 2017, people already came to the conclusion that SNED as a mechanism has lost its gist and its purpose, which is why the Trump administration basically drops the idea of SNED, and we haven't seen a systematic government-to-government dialogue mechanism being established so far. Well, I would say that COVID has played a role in it because of the travel restrictions and also because of the deterioration of the bilateral relations. The atmosphere for the two countries and two governments to come together and talk about issues of common interest is extremely limited. And also, I think there's a strong sense in both Beijing and Washington that we know exactly what the other side wants to say. And there's no room for negotiation and there's no room for persuasion. So in that sense, what's the point of coming together and talk? And at the same time, remember that if Biden administration does talk to the Chinese, there's going to be a domestic audience, including the Republicans, demanding to see concrete deliverables from those dialogues. Otherwise, they're going to question, what's the purpose of this dialogue? The Chinese are using their usual tactic of delay and conquer. So what's the point of talking without concrete deliverables? So I think all those factors have played into where we are today, which is that, well, the senior level or a established mechanism for dialogue is not visible, is not within sight.
Well, let me turn to China and Europe. Keeping a productive relationship with Europe is an essential element of today's foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy. But the security of Europe is going to be more and more in the hands of the connections between Europe and the United States, and this will have an economic consequence. I have seen President Xi Jinping and the Chinese government making an effort to keep a dialogue with the Europeans. And I've seen some of the countries a little bit more open to this dialogue, and I've seen the European Commission stricter, more attached to the principles of the European position on the Ukrainian war. So you have the US trying to motivate China to get closer to them, closer and closer, and distant from China. And you have China making an effort to keep Europe close to them because they have had a good economic relationship for many decades, particularly Germany and China, or France and China. And it's very important for China to keep this relationship in healthy, in good shape. What's your view about China and Europe? Is there a positive or a more negative future for the relationship?
Well, that's a very good question. Is it positive or is it negative? I feel that China's relationship with Europe has always been the combination of the two, that there are significant trade relations. Remember, China's trade with Europe is in fact larger than China's trade with the United States. Last year, China's trade with Europe, it was, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was 828 billion US dollars. And China's trade with the United States was smaller than that, 750 billion US dollars. And also, I think that puts China's trade with Europe and US together basically more than $1.5 trillion. And that is basically 10 times larger than China's trade with Russia. So it goes back to the issue that we talked earlier about the sanction that, well, China's trade with Russia is simply not large enough. There's no debate because China's relationship with the West is so much more significant in terms of trade. But coming back to China's relationship with Europe, I think there are three caveats, at least from the Chinese calculation. The first one is that the war in Ukraine has consolidated NATO as an anti-Russia military alliance, but it has not transformed NATO into an anti-China military alliance. So there is a difference between the anti-Russia agenda and anti-China agenda. And the Chinese will say that Europeans have signed on to the American agenda to oppose Russia. But whether that commitment also extends to the issue of China, I think that the answer is much less clear and evident. The second caveat lies in the economic relations between China and Europe. So like I mentioned, China and Europe has such significant trade relations, which means that the Chinese are much more confident about their handling of relationship with Europe because China is a market that no European countries or European companies will be willing or able to ignore. So this goes back to whether the same sanctions put on Russia can also be applied on China. And I think the Chinese answer is negative because the Chinese market is simply so much more consequential. So I think for what that means that for the second caveat, it means that the Chinese believe that they have stronger leverage in terms of the trade relations and the market access issue vis-a-vis Europe than the Russia ever will. And that goes to the third question, which is the strategic alignment between US and Europe and how sustainable that is. And I think this question, I've heard very different answers from different people, even here in the United States. And the logic is this: as a result of the war in Ukraine, we're seeing the European countries suddenly waking up to the security threat that Russia poses. And they scrambled and they produced decisive and rapid, swift actions to punish Russia. And the result of that, we're seeing that Germany is adopting new positions on their defense policies that we have not seen for 7 decades. Germany has decided to allocate 2% of its GDP towards its defense budget. And of course, in the short term, I think what we're seeing is that US, Europe are aligning their positions, strengthening their deterrence and strengthening their alliance vis-a-vis Russia. But I think it also begs the question, is there going to be a growing desire for strategic autonomy from Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine? And I don't have an answer to that question because the Chinese believe that Europe will emerge from this war in Ukraine as a more strategically autonomous player, independent from the United States. And I have heard from some European countries that, no, that is not going to happen. That is completely misunderstanding of where Europe is, because our NATO alliance with the United States has not been stronger ever. So, but then if you ask strategic thinkers in the United States, I see answers or the opinions from both sides. Some people believe that, oh yeah, NATO has been strengthened like never before. But on the other hand, there are also doubts and skepticisms as for, is Europe going to be more autonomous from now on? So I think those three factors determine that in terms of China-Europe relations, the Chinese do not believe that all is lost. In fact, they believe that there is also a sign of hope, which is European strategic autonomy. Whether that is a Chinese misconception or misperception about the European strategy, I think that remains to be seen.
Well, I fully agree with you. Let's turn to Taiwan, because Taiwan is a very crucial topic in China-US relations and in China's positioning in the Pacific. I once read a comment by Yuan Shuitong, it was in one of his books, saying that if China does not conquer hegemony in the Chinese Sea, China Sea, and in the waters in East Asia, China will not be able to make the China dream come true. And when we look at the Pacific, in the area of China and in the China Sea, Taiwan is an important topic, because Taiwan is the frontier between peace and war in a large scale, I would say. Then there is a lot of speculation about the Chinese position regarding Taiwan at this point as a consequence of the Ukrainian war. I don't think that China is going to make any move. And I also believe that, China understands that the sanctions imposed on Russia are something to be observed and something that may happen if China decides a more forceful solution in Taiwan. But, there is also always lingering in the air this idea that the Taiwan question could be solved or could see some new developments in the near future. What's your view on that?
My view is that it depends on the definition of the near future. Because, well, for China has a history of 5,000 years. A near future could mean something very different from the say the Americans. So I think this idea of unification through the use of force, it has always been reserved as an option, because the Chinese never abandoned the use of force, right? But in the Chinese playbook, use of force for the purpose of unification is entirely different from use of force for the prevention of Taiwan independence. My understanding of China's policy is that China is reserving the military option on Taiwan in order to prevent Taiwan from going independent. But whether China will use force to subdue Taiwan, occupy Taiwan, I think that's a much more debatable question. Well, the caveat is that who gets to define what moves by Taiwan constitute Taiwan independence? And I think that's the Chinese ambivalence. They try to maintain the maximum flexibility. So if they want to interpret a certain move by DPP government as a pursuit of Taiwan independence, they can. But their interpretation is being disagreed upon by the United States. And the real issue emerged after the inauguration of Tsai Ing-wen as a DPP president back in 2016, because when the KMT is in power in Taiwan, mainland China believes that, well, KMT wants unification eventually, so they could agree to work with KMT under the framework of 92 consensus, which basically says one China but different interpretations between mainland and Taiwan, right? But the problem is for the Chinese, Tsai Ing-wen does not accept 92 consensus. And she has never accepted 92 consensus. So for China, what that means is that, well, if you don't accept 92 consensus, it means that you do not accept that there is one China. And the Chinese, therefore, has not been able to develop a new policy platform under which they will be able to engage DPP in dialogues and conversations. And instead, they resort to coercion, gray zone operations, and diplomatic coercion to force DPP to come back to this one China platform. And that's really the essence of the debate that we're seeing here. But at the same time, China will say, Taiwan is pursuing Taiwan independence, therefore we need to prepare for military options. But on the other hand, the United States says Taiwan doesn't accept one China principle. It doesn't mean that she is pursuing Taiwan independence either. So US does not agree with the Chinese assessment and will see this Chinese attempt to coerce Taiwan as a violation of the US bottom line, which is peaceful resolution of the issue of Taiwan. So that's the background of this. So where is China going to go from here? One most important caveat or the lessons or the takeaway that China has from the Russian war in Ukraine, in fact, is this. Peaceful unification is still the preferred approach.
Yes.
If there is a chance, if there is a way that we can avoid a war, let's avoid a war with Taiwan because of the uncertainty. But there are also, of course, a lot of military tactical and operational lessons the PLA is drawing from the war in Ukraine. But I think for the time being, the Chinese priority still remains with the peaceful unification. And this is also evident from the 2035 vision, which is a visionary document the Chinese government produced last year as a national guideline for China's national development. And within that grand strategy, that development strategy, national unification was not mentioned as a priority. And the priority was still specified to be continued economic development to help China to achieve its 2-100 goals, basically the boosting China's economic growth further on the ladder. And national unification, I don't see it as a priority, which means the national resources is not being allocated in that direction, which means that I don't think that China is aiming for a military takeover of Taiwan in the foreseeable future. And to define the foreseeable future, I would say 5 to 10 years.
Okay. Yusun, in a recent article of yours, you said that the notion of national security in China is different from the notion of national security in the US or in the West. Could you explain a little bit your point of view on that?
Of course. So under Xi Jinping, China has developed an overall outlook or the overall definition of comprehensive national security, which encompasses, I believe, 17 categories of national security, including biological security, including financial security, including food security. But the core of the Chinese concept of national security lies in regime security. And that is the security of the Chinese Communist Party as a ruling party, as a ruling regime of China. And that, I call it a fundamental difference between China's concept of national security and Western concept of national security. Regime security is primarily a domestic issue, right? It's a domestic term. It's about whether the legitimacy, authority, and credibility of the Chinese Communist Party is protected. And to basically treat regime security as a top priority of China's national security means that, well, China will mobilize all resources to protect its regime security. And sometimes you would wonder that, well, if regime security means that CCP's security as a ruling party, as a one party in China, then what does it mean for the nation? And here, I think scholars have developed different views about the difference between regime security and national security. Because by equating these two concepts together, Chinese Communist Party is saying, I am the nation, I am the state. And the state of the party is the state of the nation. And from a Western point of view, there is a very big difference, right, between the security of, say, Republican Party as an opposition party, or let's say the security of the Democratic Party as a ruling party, and the national security of the United States. So I would say that this idea of regime security equating to national security is a very unique Chinese phenomena, and is fundamentally different from the Western notion of national security.
And what's the compatibility between this notion and a political structure where decision-making is collective? Do you think that China has a feeling now that the collective decision-making procedures are no longer, appropriate for the reality?
Well, before Xi Jinping, the Chinese system or the Chinese bureaucracy, the elite politics has evolved to come to a consensus that that within the party on the top, they observe a principle called democratic centralism, meaning that the members of the Politburo Standing Committee, the 9 members under Hu Jintao, they were relatively speaking, they were equals. Hu Jintao was the first among his equals, the first among the 9, and he was regarded as the most important leader among the 9 members of the Politburo. But there was a sense of, some sense of equality and some sense of, debates can be had, disagreement is possible, and discussions could be held on certain specific issues. And also under Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping's predecessor, among the 9 members of the Politburo Standing Committee, they also had a division of labor. So for example, Zhou Yongkang, the former security czar, he was in charge of state security. He was in charge of public security. So that was a division of labor that was more evident under Hu Jintao, but is no longer evident under Xi Jinping. Under Xi Jinping, the key word or the slogan is that all authority goes to Xi, or all authorities lies with Xi. It's called 定于一尊. So Xi Jinping enjoys all the authority. And Xi Jinping is also the chair of all the commissions and leading small groups on issues from deepening reform to the Taiwan issue, to the National Security Commission, to the Foreign Affairs Commission. So we see that Xi Jinping is wearing all hats, which means that within the Chinese elite, the top level of the leadership today is no longer an equal relationship between Xi and the other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee. Instead, this is, I would say, is much more hierarchical. It's a hierarchy with Xi on the top, with all the other 6 members of the Politburo Standing Committee serving Xi and serving at his beck and call. So I would say that is a deviation from the consensus and the tradition that was reached under Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao. But whether this is going to be a continued phenomena or continued mechanism, say that with Xi Jinping's successor, we don't know who that person will be or when that will ever happen. But whether this is a Xi-specific phenomena or this is going to be a continued mechanism in the Chinese Communist Party, that remains to be seen.
We have a technical problem. I disappeared from the screen, but I'm still here asking questions. Let me ask you a question about the internal reality in China, since you mentioned Xi Jinping and his leadership. I think that the big question we all entertain is who's coming with Xi Jinping next, isn't it? Is the generation that is already in power coming with him, or they are going to be replaced by younger leaders? And we see in a number of provinces in China, younger leaders taking place and having a position. What's your guess on that? I know it's just a guess because we don't know what's going to happen. I think they themselves do not know in China, but what's your guess? What's your assessment of this distance between the old generation, the new generation, and the control of power in China?
Boy, that's a $1 million question. And I don't know if I have the answer, but I will share with you 2 observations. The first one is that the Chinese Communist Party takes pride in its mechanism called meritocracy. And the Chinese Communist Party has justified its legitimacy and justified its superiority in terms of performance based on this notion of meritocracy, meaning that officials and leaders, they are selected from the bottom to the top through many layers of competition, many layers of screening, and many layers of evaluation. So only those that are able to navigate all sorts of challenges, political, security, economic, environmental. So the conclusion or the observation from the meritocracy is anyone who has reached to the top are among the elite and the most effective leaders and officials that China and the Chinese system can produce. So I think meritocracy is actually a factor that the Chinese Communist Party takes great pride in, which means that for anyone who has reached the level of, say, a governor of a province in China, or even further on the Politburo in China, they have undergone through many rounds of tests, of lessons, of selections, and they are selected for very specific reasons, that these people are qualified leaders. And that gets to the second point. Then, well, if there's this many qualified people, then who is going to be the leader, right? That there is only one, number one, the president of China, and that's only one position. And here I want to refer to something back in the Chinese history. And in ancient Chinese dynasties, of course, the sons of the emperor would compete for the crown prince position. Everybody wants to be the crown prince, right? But repeated stories in Chinese history has illustrated one truth, which is when the emperor is not ready to retire, to compete to be the crown prince is not the smartest strategy. Because it tells the leader, tells the number one leader that you want to replace him. And that raises all kinds of suspicions and problems. So I would say that the most likely successor of Xi Jinping currently in China is a person who is not showing any intention to be Xi Jinping's successor, because you will not want to appear so ambitious that it raises skepticism and questions from the top leader as for what your intention is. So that is my take.
That's very good, very, very good. Let us continue to talk about the internal reality in China. I've seen a number of academics now having independent positions regarding the Ukrainian war. Some of them saying that China should not be that close to Russia. China should have its own independent position. The damages can be, very big if China keeps its own position, this position. We have also seen, as a consequence of COVID and of the zero COVID policy, many people expressing their dissatisfaction in Shanghai and other places. Is this a sign of change or not necessarily? And particularly about the Ukrainian war, why is it that, in your view, China has been more flexible about academics' positions regarding the war?
Well, the simple answer is people disagree. There are plenty of people in China who regard Russia as a problem. And they believe that Russia has played China, has manipulated Xi Jinping, and put China in the impossible position to either deny or acknowledge that China did know or did not know about the Russian plan for invasion when Putin visited Beijing on February the 4th and issued a joint statement with Xi that basically termed China-Russia relationship as there's no limit to our cooperation. And I think a lot of Russia specialists in China resent the fact that Putin played China and Putin manipulated China. And this is actually an interesting observation in the Chinese policy community, that all those who claim that Russia is China's best friend are not Russia specialists. Russia specialists inevitably and without exception has a very dark, very negative view about Russia's strengths and Russia's manipulation of China throughout history. And remember, between China and Russia, Deng Xiaoping used to say, historically, there are only two countries that have done great damage to China, has hurt China most. One is Japan during the anti-Japanese war, and one is Russia. And Russia is a country that has taken more than 1.5 million square kilometers of Chinese territory during the Qing dynasty in the 19th century. And if you count in other territories that Russia also, well, not stealing from, Russia did not steal from China, but nevertheless, Russia was the reason that the Chinese lost those territory, including Mongolia. The total territory that China lost because of Russia is more than 4 million square kilometers. That's like half of China's size today. So I think for the Chinese policy community, this deep suspicion of Russia's intention and Russia's manipulation of China is always there and is always deeply embedded. So what this means is that when the Russian war in Ukraine happened, although the top of the government says, well, because of our fear and our concern about the United States, we're not going to come out and oppose Russia. But there are also plenty of people in China who believe that this was a wrong call. So that's why we're seeing this criticisms of Russia and indirectly criticisms of China's current policy on Russia keeps bubbling up in the Chinese policy community. And the link to this to the issue of COVID lockdown in Shanghai and other cities in China, I think what this points out is an inconvenient truth for the Chinese Communist Party, which is an authoritarian system can always limp on. There are problems, there are challenges, but they can always limp on. But the true test happens when there is an unexpected stress being imposed on the system, like on the Shanghai lockdown. So before the lockdown in Shanghai, people find it incomprehensible that this is Shanghai, this is the most advanced, most open, and most reformed city in the whole China. And how could Shanghai be in any way put in that kind of misery? And I think that's where the system's shortcoming and the system's weakness really reveals itself, that without such a crisis like the COVID, the city can move on and it's okay. But when there is such an unexpected stressor being put on the system, that's a real test. And what this means is that I call it the domestic stress, which is the COVID, the lockdowns that we're seeing across China, and the external stressor, which is Russian war in Ukraine, is creating a very difficult position for the Chinese leadership today. That there is no success, basically. China is still observing the zero COVID policy. China is still not open when the rest of the world is open. Basically, look at President Biden is traveling to Europe and traveling to Asia, and Chinese top leader Xi Jinping has been grounded in Beijing for more than 2 years and 4 months now. So this has put China in what I call a strategic low tide. But this is also happening because of a specific reason, which is the 20th Party Congress that will be happening in the fall. China will take all the cost to maintain its stability and maintain a COVID-free environment until the 20th Party Congress is over and Xi Jinping's third term is inked. So for the time being, we're looking at a 5 to 6 months period of time where China is putting under incredible pressure and stressor, both internally and externally. But after the 20th Party Congress, it's going to be a quite different story because Xi Jinping will have no concern for his third term anymore. And China will be, I believe, more bold and more assertive coming to both its domestic and foreign policies.
Well, I could keep this conversation for a long, long time, particularly now that we started to talk about the internal reality in China, but time is always a limitation. Do you want to make any final comment yourself?
Well, one observation that I think that we're seeing is about the BRICS virtual summit that happened earlier this week. And Brazil, of course, is a consequential partner in the BRICS framework. And we are seeing that China is trying to align its positions with BRICS countries in light of this international difficulty and this obstacles that China is faced with. We know that Brazil and South Africa do not always see eye to eye with the West, even on the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We see that India is very much trying to maintain a neutral position on the issue of Russia because of India's deep relationship, deep ties with Russia. So I think China is trying to capitalize on this BRICS format or this BRICS framing in order to mitigate international isolation and try to align positions among the five members of BRICS, and to develop new platforms of its diplomacy. So I think that is an important area that Brazil could play an important role. Thank you, Ambassador.
No, I agree fully with you. I noticed that President Xi Jinping yesterday opened the Ministers of Foreign Affairs meeting at ASEAN. This is not a practice, it's new. And he had a very strong message about keeping cooperation alive and making efforts to stay together. And I think that all in all the BRICS countries are willing to stay together and continue the project and improve the level of dialogue that they have and increase the opportunities for cooperation, you see. And I myself had doubts about the fact that the meeting could happen or not, and the meeting will happen. And although the circumstances are difficult, and you know, it's very difficult to make plans about the future at this point, but I think it's a positive thing that the meeting is going to happen, that the presidents are going to have a dialogue, to entertain a dialogue, that the ministers of foreign affairs are entertaining a dialogue. And I think that the individual positions taken by Brazil, a little bit different from the positions taken by China and India and South Africa, but I think they do not at all create difficulties to a productive dialogue within the BRICS. And I thank you very much for raising this point, because then we have a look towards the future. Thank you very much for your presence. It was really very enjoyable to talk to you and listen from you. You have bright observations about China and China's connection with the world. And I think our audience has also appreciated as much as I did this conversation with you. Thank you, Yunsun.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for a very lively and thought-provoking conversation. Thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to future further engagement. Thank you.
You're going to be invited for other discussions. Thank you for the public.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for the public that remain with us, and to our sponsors, Convida. Bye-bye.
Absolutely.